Good morning, everyone. We will start again with the lectures in this first day of the training school. The first lecture will be given by me on deterioration of concrete by sulphate attack. My name is Gruyaert. I'm affiliated with KU Leuven. After doing my PhD and my postdoc at Ghent University, I moved towards KU Leuven in Ghent in 2017. And I'm happy to be here today. I'm also the Outreach and Disseminator Coordinator of the SmartThings project, and you will see that really at the end of the presentation, because there I will give you a save the date for our conference of next year also. Okay, we will start about sulphate attack in concrete. So I'm very happy that the colleagues just before me in the program have introduced again the cement chemistry, the hydration of cements and so on, because we will really need it here in the presentation. So first of all, sulphate attack covers a series of chemical reactions between sulphate ions, of course, and the cement paste in concrete, and caused by the exposure of concrete to sulfates and moisture. And it's really a complex set of overlapping chemical reactions. So this will be the conclusion that sulphate attack is really complex and that we cannot deal with everything here today in this 3/4 of an hour session. But I hope you will have the basics over here and you are interested to learn more about it in literature and from the lab sessions. So also the chemical reactions are influenced by the environmental and physical conditions, as we will see later on. So from where do the sulfates come? Well, in concrete they can come from different sources. So first of all, they can be from external, so they can intrude the concrete, and they are present, for instance, in groundwater, seawater, industrial wastewater, and so on. So this type of sulphate attack we call external sulphate attack. If the sulfates are already present in the mix from the start, coming from the cement or aggregates or so on, so then we can talk about a composition-induced internal sulphate attack. But besides that internal sulphate attack, we also have the special form of internal sulphate attack, the heat-induced thermal internal sulphate attack, or the delayed ettringite formation, that we will also tackle here in the presentation. And there, of course, temperatures plays an important role. So then in the presentation, we will deal with different types of sulphate attack, and they are distinguished as the chemical sulphate attack, the physical sulphate attack, and the delayed ettringite formation. We will also look at combined attack, because in a lot of cases, different ions are present. Think about the seawater, where the chlorides, for instance, and the sulfates, amongst others, are together present. And as Nele already has been talking about the biogenic sulfuric acid attack, we will not deal anymore with this in the current presentation. So degradation phenomena due to sulphate attack are also very diverse. It can go about cracking, spalling, increased permeability, strength loss, etc. So we will see in the next slides what will occur. And then a last item is also, what we are testing in the lab is that's now really representing what is happening in situ in the field. So test methods that we apply in the lab are mainly accelerated, and we accelerate them in different ways, as we will see later on in the presentation, by increasing sulfate concentration, using smaller specimens, increase the water-cement ratio, use internal sources of sulfate, and so on. But of course, all of them have consequences. So the question is, how relevant are they, or how representative are they? Okay, so also when we are doing tests, we have to use a parameter to quantify the degradation. And as we have seen just before, there are a lot of degradation phenomena. So this means that we also have different parameters to look at. And this can be expansion, compressive strength, mass loss that occurs over time. And it's generally known that only one of these parameters is probably not enough in order to have a good view on what is really happening there. So ending the introduction over here, its sulfate attack is very complex, as you can see from all the different parameters, from all the different degradation phenomena and so on. So yeah, we will not be able to explain everything here, but we will give a short overview so that you have at least a starting point about this item. So in the presentation, a lot of information is taken from the references as given over here in the list. So also these references, if you want to know more about it, can be helpful to inform you better. Okay, so let's start with the first type of sulfate attack, which is the chemical sulfate attack. And there we first have to distinguish between the other ion with which the sulfates come together. So this can be the alkali, the calcium or magnesium ions. And of course, depending on whether you have a sodium sulfate, for instance, and calcium sulfate, a magnesium sulfate, which is attacking your concrete, you will have a different attack mechanism, but also a different damage pattern, and of course, due to the different chemical reactions that occurred over there. So we will look one by one, and starting with the sodium sulfate. So first of all, the main phase that is attacked in a Portland cement system when it comes into contact with sodium sulfate is the monosulfate. And as you have seen from the presentation of Professor De Bailey, the monosulfate is there in your mix because your C3A mineral is with the calcium sulfate reacting, forming the ettringite, and the ettringite is further transformed to the monosulfate. So when now this concrete or cement paste or mortar comes into contact with a sodium sulfate solution, the monosulfate is transformed to ettringite again. So calcium is used coming from the calcium hydroxide, and later, when the calcium hydroxide has been used a lot, also the the CSH, excuse me, will further decalcify in order to provide the additional calcium ions that are needed for this. Good. So after that, if the aluminium ions are used and there is still sulfate present, then mainly gypsum will be formed, as you can see over here, and this gypsum is mostly then appearing in the zones closer to the surface of your concrete element. So what does ettringite formation lead to? Well, it is an expensive process, as was already told by Professor De Bailey, and of course this expensive process can first help in filling the pores, but after some time it will cause stresses and cracking. So cracking phenomena happen in that case. In case of gypsum formation, literature is a bit debating about the fact whether this is leading to expansion, yes or no, but it is in fact the mean product that is created when the pH is below 11.5, because at that point the ettringite is not stable anymore and cannot exist at that moment. We also have seen that at some point calcium ions are needed from the calcium silicate hydrate, and of course that means that your calcium silicate hydrate is decalcifying, leading to a strength loss. So you see that we have different mechanisms here of attack due to sodium sulfate. Moreover, we have the sodium, or when you are looking at potassium sulfate, you have the same, you have the potassium over there. So there is also a concurrent risk to have alkali silica reactions, and I guess in another presentation there will be more about that, due to the fact that we have this sodium or potassium available in the pore solution. So this is a kind of combined attack that is also happening at that moment. If you are looking then at the next one, which is the calcium sulfate, as you can see over here, the main phase that is attacked in a Portland cement system is the monosulfate. The monosulfate, again, of course, converting towards ettringite formation. And at this moment, it's not like with the sodium sulfate that we need calcium ions from somewhere else. No, we have now the calcium sulfate here as the attacking mechanism. So this means that calcium is supplied by the calcium sulfate source itself, and so no CSH decalcification is occurring over here. The same is happening as just before. We have the monosulfate transforming to ettringite, an expensive process, first filling pores, but later on causing stresses, cracking, and strength loss, and in that way degrading your matrix. The next one is related with magnesium sulfate. And this is a quite different mechanism, let's say, that is happening, because the main phase that is now attacked is your calcium hydroxide, and the calcium hydroxide reacting with the magnesium sulfate will lead to magnesium hydroxide and the gypsum. So as Professor Billy already told us, we have the brucite or the magnesium hydroxide, which can act also as a protective layer, slowing down the degradation. But yeah, what we have here is that we have calcium hydroxide reacting. So this means that at some point also the CSH will decompose, because the CSH will release the calcium hydroxide because it's used in the reaction with the magnesium sulfate. The magnesium hydroxide is very insoluble, and yeah, of course, the reaction will always go on, because when the CSH is releasing the calcium hydroxide to restore your equilibrium pH, at that moment, it will immediately be used by the magnesium sulfates in order to form again these reaction products. And of course, by decalcifying the CSH, we have the formation of magnesium silicate hydrates and hydrous silica. So we have a fast degradation, mainly with strength reduction as a degradation phenomena. It's possible that ettringite is formed, but this is done more to the interior of your specimen, where your pH is still high enough, because we have seen already here in the previous slide that when the pH becomes too low, that the ettringite becomes unstable, and this is of course what is happening more to the surface over here by consuming your portlandite in the reactions with magnesium sulfate. So we will see later on that there are a lot of mitigation strategies to reduce sulfate attack, and one of them is using cements with low C3A content. Of course, if you look here at the magnesium sulfate attack mechanism, it will not really help because it's attacking the calcium hydroxide and the calcium silicate hydrates, and it's totally different than what we have seen just before with the other ones, the sodium sulfate and the calcium sulfate attacking the monosulfate. Okay, so then we move on to the next one, which is a special form of sulfate attack, the thaumasite formation. So in this kind of sulfate attack mechanism, we will have the calcium silicate hydrates, which are moving, let's say, towards a thaumasite product. And as you can see from the formula over here, we need for that carbonate ions. So these carbonates can come from ingredients within the matrix, within your concrete matrix, from the aggregates, from the fillers, but can also come from carbonation from the air that is happening. Further on, we have the silicates, which come, of course, from the calcium silicate hydrates. And we also need a sulfate source, which can be from internal or can come from an external source. So internally, you can have it because of carbonation. We have seen that if the pH decreases, what is happening in case of carbonation, you have, of course, a pH decrease, the ettringite becomes unstable, and in that way you have sulfates being present in order to form the thaumasite form. So the degradation mechanism together with it is a strength loss due to the decomposition of your calcium silicate hydrates in your system. So in general, it's said that the temperature should be lower than 15 degrees in order to have this, but literature is a bit debating on that. So I put it with a question mark over here, and it only happens in case of pH larger than 10.5. Okay, so I think another important aspect that is mentioned over here below is about thaumasite formation in real structures, because if you read about that, you can see that, yeah, thaumasite formation is probably seen as a secondary degradation mechanism preceded by another sulfate attack or damage happening beforehand due to cracking. Okay, so that were the ones we wanted to talk into detail about the chemical sulfate attack. As I told you already, over the sulfate acid attack and the biogenic sulfuric acid attack, I will not talk here, because this is of course a combination of sulfates and acids that is attacking the concrete. We were talking about the sodium sulfates, the magnesium sulfates, the calcium sulfates, the thaumasite formation. And then we ended up with this slide where we are looking, let's say, in prevention or mitigation measures that we can take in order to avoid this. So first of all, we told that there should be a good knowledge on the environmental parameters, so the items related to the sulfate itself, the concentration and the type. And then secondly, also the temperature and the relative humidity. And then we were also looking, if we know that, how we can make a good mix. So we should make a proper mix design, but also placement and curing of the concrete should be done in a good way. So the first item we were looking at was the water-cement ratio, being a very important parameter, because this is related to the quality and the impermeability of the concrete. The water-cement ratio, when this is low, leads of course to a decrease in the transport properties, but we also said that we should be careful, because lower water-cement ratio means higher autogeneous shrinkage, so we should avoid early age shrinkage, of course, otherwise the transport properties are again increased. A second item is about the choice of the binder material, so the cement we are using. So there we should have a look to have a high sulfate resisting cement with a low C3A, and some standards also speak about a C4AF content that should stay within the limits. So important there was that this really helps when it deals with sulfate attack that really attacks the aluminate phases. But when it deals, of course, with decomposition of CSH, yeah, then it doesn't help a lot. The use of additions, fly ash, granulated blast furnace slag and silica fume were then considered. And we have seen that they can have beneficial properties regarding resistance to sulfate attack, as they increase the densification of the matrix. They reduce the calcium hydroxide content because of their pisolanic reactivity. And of course, if the calcium hydroxide content is reduced, also the gypsum formation is reduced. And then thirdly, if they have a reduced C3A content, the binders made with these additions, we of course also come into the high sulfate resisting cements. So curing is very important, as I told you already, and especially for these concretes with these supplementary cementitious materials, as they react slower, and we should be sure that curing is done in a good way. So then we move on to just an example, still from my PhD, so it's already from 2011, but in my PhD I was looking at the effect of ground granulated blast furnace slag on different durability properties, and one of them was sulfate attack. So here you see results from mortar bars that were made and tested according to procedure that was based on the ASTM C1012 standard. And that was complete submersion of these prisms in a sodium sulfate solution. We measured the relative length change in function of the time. So you see it's the number of months. So the test takes quite a lot of time in order to finalize. So we didn't do the last step exactly according to the standard because we didn't replenish anymore the sulfate solution, and this is the reason why I put it in dashed lines and not in a full line over here. But we clearly see from the start a first phase where nothing happens, almost nothing happens. It's a bit zoomed in on the right figure. We see not a steady increase, but this is of course due to different reasons, and the one is that, yeah, the changes are within the accuracy of the measuring equipment, and we also did not coat the end faces, so we could have some crumbling that led to these fluctuations that you see over there. But after that first stage, first 3 months, let's say, where nothing happens, then we had an increase of the volume of the length. And there we clearly saw a distinction between the specimens made with ordinary Portland cement, so the black lines, and then the gray and the green line, which are the ones with 50% of cement replaced by blast furnace slag, or 85% of the cement replaced by blast furnace slag. So if we then were looking which products were formed, then we used XRD analysis, and we also used just a visual inspection, as you can see on the right hand side. So where you see a part of the prism with longitudinal cracks and transverse cracks. And we also saw that the ettringite was formed there. And this corresponded also with the fact that we had a pH of 12.8, if I remember well. So meaning that this is a pH at which the ettringite can really be formed. So you see then also in the picture below the mortar with 85% of blast furnace slag, which is as good as intact, so without any damage that is there. So this is just an example of how the additions can change the performance regarding sulfate attack. So then we will move to the second item, and this is about a physical sulfate attack. So first of all, it's important that you never can see physical sulfate attack as something completely separate. It's also always in combination with chemical sulfate attack. So the chemical processes occur together with the salt crystallization, and the salt crystallization is seen as a physical process, and therefore it's called physical sulfate attack. So which elements will now be prone to that physical sulfate attack? These are elements which are partially submerged in a sulfate solution or partially buried in sulfate containing ground. So if you see on the right hand side, I just tried to make a figure where you can see a concrete sample partly immersed in a sulfate solution. So first of all, water and of course ions, as the sulfates that will be present in the water, will intrude in your specimens, and the water and the ions in it will transport in your concrete towards the drying surface. Over here, as you can see with the with the blue arrows, excuse me. So then the water will evaporate, of course, here at the drying surface, while the sulfates, which cannot move together with the water vapor to the air, stay into the concrete surface layer. So there are different mechanisms that happen. So you have the capillary suction, diffusion, and evaporation processes in that first item, the wick action. And then, of course, due to that, you have a high sulfate concentration near the surface, and that causes back diffusion. And you get, of course, finally a nearly saturated pore solution near the surface. And there you can have, as you can see here, in the case of sodium sulfate solution, a supersaturation that leads to crystallization pressure in the pores. And you can see the salt crystals that are formed over there. In case of sodium sulfate attack, you have in fact the crystallization of the salts that can occur in the pores. And good, due to the changing environmental conditions, temperature and relative humidity, you can have a phase transformation from the thinardite to the mirabilite. And yeah, just by having this reversible change, you have the crystallization pressure that leads finally to degradation of your superficial layer. So this is first part about that. In my PhD, I was also looking at what happens with my specimens, now with our concrete specimens, when they are exposed to partial submersion and also cyclical submersion. So what you here recognize is probably what you have seen this morning in the presentation of Professor De Bailey, where she showed the same type of equipment that was used for acid attack, but here the concrete wheels, let's say, turn into a sulphate solution. So part of the time they are immersed, part of the time they are not immersed, and here the middle zone is in fact never immersed in the sulphate solution. And although it was the aim for us to have a look at the cyclic immersion and measure also with the lasers the degradation that would occur here at the side surfaces which are exposed to the sodium sulfate solution. In fact, we had much more degradation here in the zone due to physical sulfate attack. And we could have this degradation because these specimens were made out of concrete where the binder consisted 50% out of blast furnace slag. And this is, of course, the more slag is in it, the more vulnerable it is to carbonation. So we had superficial carbonation of the outer layer. And if you have carbonation, the calcium carbonate and the salts do not adsorb. So this means that there is a film, an aqueous film that can be formed at the pore wall between the pore wall and your crystal, and crystallization pressure can thus be built up in that way. So due to carbonation, we enable, let's say, an accelerated damage due to salt crystallization that you see over here when we had removed the salt crystals from the outside. You really see that the concrete was damaged also over there. So then in case of magnesium sulfate solution, yeah, we find a bit contradicting information in the literature, because some researchers say that they do not find traces of salt crystallization and others. So also in my research, we reported some epsomites that could be formed also here, as you see, these harder crystals that are formed over here in case of carbonation of the surface layer. So here also the carbonation enabled the salt crystallization. And of course, this leads to the fact that we should always take care, as I already said in the previous section also, for a good curing, so that we can avoid as much as possible carbonation also, especially for these concretes with these SCMs. So we can say that physical salt attack with damage due to salt crystallization does exist and plays an aggravating role after chemical sulfate attack or in case of previous carbonation. Sometimes you have the pure crystallization effects, and this process is then enhanced by cooling, heating, or wetting and drying with cyclic crystallization of salts. So this is, in short, about this physical sulfate attack. And then, the parameters that can be looked at in order to mitigate the physical sulfate attack, or in fact the same as we discussed with the chemical sulfate attack, because chemical sulfate attack is seen as the main degradation mechanism, so the same strategies can be applied also here. And then if we look like here at the pure crystallization effects, wetting and drying, cooling and heating cycles play a role over there. Additional mitigation measures that you can take is applying a coating to the drying surface to stop or limit as much as possible the wick action, or isolate your concrete, of course, from the source that will degrade it, so from the soil, for instance. So this is in short about the physical sulfate attack. And then we will move to the next one, which was the delayed ettringite formation, so, or the heat-induced internal sulfate attack, as I also called it in one of the first slides. So let's start to look what happens in a normal environment, let's say. So a Portland system at temperatures below 60-70 degrees, then you all know already from this morning, you have the C3A phase, and okay, this calcium aluminates will react with the calcium sulfates and water to form ettringite, and the ettringite is then further transformed to monosulfates. However, at higher temperatures, the ettringite cannot be formed or is not stable, and the sulfates, yeah, they will be into monosulfate or they will be adsorbed on the CSH phase. And then, of course, when the temperature decreases later on, the monosulfates that we had over there and the sulfates that release from the CSH can form ettringite. So you have in a later phase the ettringite formation, and therefore it's called the delayed ettringite formation. We know already that that process is expensive, that it can cause stresses and also cracking of the matrix. So regarding the detailed reaction mechanism, I did not include it here because, as you see also the lower part of the slide, you can find in literature also contradictory information. So the scientific debate is still going on about that, but we know already what we can do in order to avoid this. And of course, if you think about the mechanism here, it only occurs when your temperature is higher than 60-70 degrees. So you can already know in which applications that this will occur. So I think everyone can agree that in precast concrete industry, where you have steam or heat cured elements, that you have the higher temperatures. So they're better to keep it below 60-70 degrees in order to avoid this degradation mechanisms. Also in hot climates, you can have these high temperatures, especially in massive elements where you even have, due to the heat of hydration, and a further increase, let's say, of the temperature inside of your concrete. So, so knowing where it can happen also, let's say, helps us in order to identify how we should reduce the risk of having this. Okay, and then we move on to the combined attack. First of all, I put some slides from laboratory experiments from the colleagues at KU Ghent, where under laboratory conditions, combined attack of sodium sulfate and sodium chloride is investigated, or magnesium sulfate with sodium chloride, as we will see in the later slides. And this is, of course, a first step towards what happens in seawater, where you have, amongst others, these main ions present. So in this slide you can see the mass change in function of the immersion time for mortars made of ordinary Portland cement, high sulfate resisting cement, or a binder consisting 50% out of Portland cement and 50% out of blast furnace slag. We have this in immersed in a solution of sodium sulfate, or in a solution made of sodium sulfate and sodium chloride. So left is, let's say, the individual degradation mechanism, right is the combined degradation mechanism. And we clearly see, if we look at the left-hand side, that the ordinary Portland cement does not perform as well as the high sulfate resisting cement and the blast furnace slag cement. So that's also what we expect, of course. We see when we add the sodium chlorides that the ordinary Portland cement mix that was worse at the left-hand side now becomes as good as the others on the right-hand side. So there is a positive influence on the sodium sulfate attack due to the chlorides. For the high sulfate resisting and S50 mixes, there was neither a positive nor a negative effect that could be detected. The colleagues also had a look at the XRD results, so looking at which reaction products were formed. And okay, we all know already that the sulfates would like to bind with the C3A, but also chlorides would like to bind with the C3A. So both of them are fighting to have the C3A as their friend. So then in case of sulfates, we form ettringite. In case of chlorides, we form Friedel salt. And from the results, you can clearly see that in the solution where only the sodium sulfates are present, gypsum and ettringite could be found, typical for the sulfate attack, now Friedel salt. And then in case the sodium chlorides were added, we have of course less gypsum and less ettringite, but also the Friedel salt has been formed. So the deterioration phenomena that we saw in the case of ordinary Portland cement was now mitigated due to the binding competition between the ions. So this is what we can see from here. The same was done for magnesium sulfate and sodium chloride. And there it was detected that there is a temperature and a binder dependent effect. So first of all, you see here results at 20 degrees. The same type of tests were done, except that the sodium sulfate was now replaced by magnesium sulfate solution. And we clearly see now that there is no effect from of the chlorides on the deterioration due to the magnesium sulfate in case of OPC and the HSR mixtures. So we see these two are still also there at the same height. But there are negative effects now for the blast furnace slag mix. So we now see that this performs less good in case of chlorides being present. And this was due to the increased decomposition of the calcium silicate hydrates to magnesium silicate hydrates by absence of a protective brucite layer. Because of course, in the case of blast furnace slag, we have less calcium hydroxide produced. There is less cement present, so less brucite due to that. And at 5 degrees, so tests were also done at 5 degrees, there we could see that the degradation for all of the mixes is here intensified, so they are just all going lower. A larger mass change was detected, and this was detected to be due to the increased talmazite formation in the combined solutions. So of course this is laboratory work where we just combine two chemicals, let's say the sodium sulfate with a sodium chloride or the magnesium sulfate with a sodium chloride. In seawater we of course have much more ions being present, of which the main ones are of course the sulfate, sodium, magnesium and chloride ions. Also, seawater composition can change a lot depending on the location where you are. So that means that also the damage can be changing depending on the location you are. So you just see here for your information artificial seawater based on the North Sea composition, how it's made. So you see that more than these sodium, sulfate, magnesium and chloride ions are present over there. So when you look into the literature, what is advised in case of concrete structures that are exposed to seawater, then you see that you should use an HSR cement. That's also what the codes are pointing to. This HSR cement has a lower content of C3A, as we already know. But that means, of course, that there is also less binding capacity for the chlorides, so maybe a higher risk for chloride-induced corrosion. So we should take care always about that. So just some points, I added there 4 points at the right-hand side of the slides regarding to the attack of seawater, where we can find that ettringite is typically non-expanding in the presence of excessive amount of chlorides. That the main degradation is due to degrading of the CSH phase. That of course in and above the tidal zone we have the salt crystallization, so also the physical attack can play a role, and you have the waves for instance, which can also lead to additional mechanical erosion. So these are just some points that should also be taken into account. Okay, and then we end up maybe with a short discussion on laboratory testing regarding sulphate attack. So here I refer also to the critical review that was written by the colleagues from Ghent and Toronto some time ago, where they looked at the realistic methods versus accelerated methods. And they critically reviewed all the accelerated methods in order to see what's the effect of the parameters that are applied over there. So first of all, if we can apply a realistic method, that's of course always the best solution, because then the deterioration process you didn't change, so you really reflect what is happening in the field. Problem is, of course, that you need very sensitive equipment to follow up this sulphate attack under realistic conditions, and that you probably will only be able to monitor the first stages of the degradation. If you can do accelerated tests, the positive aspect is that you can have the whole life of the specimen simulated, but the question is how representative is it now for your field conditions? So you have... when you read the paper, you will for sure see that there are a lot of test methods that you can find in literature. So you see they were split up in external sulphate attack and internal sulphate attack over there. And I just listed at the right-hand side some different parameters. So just by the colors, you can more or less see how many of the methods each time consider each of the parameters. So the type of specimens changes widely. So we normally want to know what is happening in concrete, but in a lot of cases in the lab it's more easy to work with cement paste or with mortar specimens. Of course, then you don't take care about the interfacial transition zone that is present in concrete if you use cement paste, but there also you can find contradictory results in literature how important is ITZ is in that case, but you see some of the tests work on concrete, others on mortar, and others on cement paste. If we then look at the shape of the specimens, some of the tests deal with prisms, others deal with cylinders. I think the dimensions are the most important one if it comes up to looking into acceleration of your attack mechanism. When it comes into the shape, then of course the prisms have the edges, the sharp edges, which can lead to stress concentrations and which can in that way lead to another degradation. If we then look at the water cement ratio that is applied, yes, here you see some advice to use a water cement ratio 0.4, 0.5, 0.6, but of course, if you take the same water cement ratio, but you change the, let's say, the components in your mix, it doesn't mean that you have the same permeability of these mixes because they have the same water cement ratio. So in that way, there is also some discussion on this. If we then look at exposure, you can of course have the continuous immersion that we then look at a chemical attack or at a wetting and drying, where we also have in addition the physical attack of the specimens. If we look at the parameters that will be judged, there are also quite some different aspects. As told in the beginning already, making or choosing one is maybe not the best choice, because then you maybe do not include all the degradation phenomena that can happen at a time. But you see over here, length change is very popular, strength decrease. Some also do the mass loss in addition, and so on. So these are the most frequently occurring ones. Duration of the tests. So the tests are accelerated, but even though you see that it goes from a few hours up to 1 year, these tests that are mentioned over here. So still quite long tests that are proposed. And then to conclude, so just a further analysis of some aspects of this. So first it deals with a higher sulphate concentration. So changing the sulphate concentration can change the attack mechanism. So we should be careful if we do that, or at least know what we are doing at that moment. Some of the tests use a more realistic sulphate concentration, but they are more difficult to execute at that moment and are therefore maybe less used. If we look at continuous immersion versus cyclic or wetting and drying, in the immersed condition, we should be careful about the pH changes that occur, because if you have your specimens in a box of sulfate solution and the mass ratio of your solution versus your specimens is quite low, then you will have a fast change of your pH of your solution, as you can see there, from 7 till much higher values, 12 is there mentioned, and also the sulfate concentration decreases. And this is of course not what you normally have in reality. In reality, the pH and the sulfate concentrations stay quite constant. So it's needed, let's say, to replenish your solution regularly, to adapt your mass ratio, or to keep the pH constant by titrating with H2SO4, where you then at the same time change pH and also provide sulfate ions. Wetting and drying, as we told already, leads to a more rapid degree of hydration, and if you have the wetting and drying phenomena, then you should take care about physical and chemical processes. Looking into external versus internal sulfate attack, well, it's also a strategy, let's say, to include your sulfates already in your concrete mix in order to accelerate the process, because at that moment you let's say skip the first phase where the sulfates should intrude in your specimen, because you already have them from the beginning. So in that way you can accelerate also your test. In a lot of cases this does not simulate, of course, the field conditions, and it is also something that you should take care of if you have an concrete with a cement where supplementary cementitious materials are in it, because of course if you put your sulfates in it from the start, you will immediately have attack mechanism, and in case of concrete with SCMs, curing is very important, so maybe it's not such a good idea to do this for these kinds of concretes. Increasing the water-cement ratio as a way to increase further the sulfate attack can be done. So you increase the porosity and you have a more rapid deterioration, but you should also know that if you have more pores, you have more space available for expansive products to be located in. So the expansion starts later, and in that way, you should always know well what you are doing at a certain moment. Good. So then regarding the temperature, we have already told that temperature can play a role in a sulfate attack. We have seen it in several slides. So here it's mentioned field sulfate attack at a temperature of 9 degrees. I think this was based on a study in Germany. In the lab, we are at our countries at least always working at around 20 degrees, and we know that 15 degrees is maybe the boundary for the thaumasite formation. So the temperature can be an important factor, and we should not ignore that, and at least recognize what we are doing at that moment to take into account what type of attacks can happen at that time. So just to conclude, sulfate attack is very complex, and this presentation could not cover everything, but I hope you learned something about it. We also have seen that we can prevent sulfate attack by just following carefully what standards and codes prescribe us, by taking into account the knowledge that we have in already, and by just the proper design of the concrete mixes and the curing and processing. So this, of course, always taking into account the environmental conditions that you will be facing over the surface life of your concrete element. And then, really to finalize, I told you already, I'm the Outreach and Dissemination Coordinator of the Smart Things project, so I should make some advertisement for our conference that will take place next year in 2023 in Ghent. So please save the date, next year, 22 and 23 May. We will have this conference. There will be flyers and advertisement on the website soon by the mid of June. So also with a call for abstract submission, where the deadline will be the 1st of October this year. And you will see the conference topics, of course, deal with the smart things topics, going from self-healing of concrete until all innovative repair solutions, dealing with service life and life cycle assessment, 3D printing, but also experimental as well as modeling is considered in that way. So we really hope to see you there.